Hi, I'm Cameron.
And I'm Hayden.
And this is
Until the End of Crime.
Hayden.
Yes.
Can you explain what groupthink is?
Groupthink. Well, I'm no expert, but I think that we can define groupthink as almost kind of this amoeba-like manifestation of common thought where we begin to think as a group, this commonality or this notion starts to spread, and then people begin to take on the same thoughts, the same cognitions, and that's typically something really hard to break free from once you've engaged in groupthink, once you've decided to lend your mentality, your mentation, your perspective to that type of groupthink. Breaking away is really difficult.
Okay, yes. I also understand it as something where when you begin to think as the group is thinking, that your thoughts lack critical thinking skills.
Oh, absolutely.
There's no critical thinking happening. You're just carried away with whatever the group is saying.
You've abandoned all precepts of original thought. It no longer exists. You have now kind of mutated into this cog in a machine versus, I want to find the right analogy, but you are no longer an operator of the machine. You are a part of the machine.
Yeah.
You lend your strength to it in the form that you uplift the thing itself. You support that thing itself, that tool, versus wielding a tool to use your own thinking and putting that towards whatever cause.
You know, when I wrote the question, I was not thinking of it as something that was very topical or political.
You know, we live in Texas and we have the distinct pleasure of hearing a lot of anti-immigrant sentiments living in Texas. It is this mecca of discontent when it comes to other nationalities, especially Mexican nationals. And I have been so incredibly frustrated by this seemingly unstoppable, unexplicable following of Donald Trump and his cronies when they've now decided that ICE raids are fine in schools.
And churches.
ICE raids are fine in churches. ICE raids are fine in hospitals, a place where children should feel safest, which, haha, what a joke, because we won't do anything to keep them safe at school. But let's go ahead and add ICE raids to that.
I mean,
let's do it at church.
How many active shooter drills have you participated in? And that's supposed to be where children feel safe.
Yeah.
And Come sit in this corner. We're going to turn the lights off and we're going to be silent. You can't be on your devices and we're going to pretend like we're not here so that you don't get shot, probably.
And church spaces are supposed to be hallowed ground. They're supposed to be a place where you can feel safe, where you can find a reprieve. I know not everyone feels that way, but for migrant people who use their faith as a way to cope and deal, I think it is wild that we can take them from a place that is supposed to be so sacred and then deport them back to whatever their home country may be.
It's supposed to be a sanctuary.
Yeah.
We're supposed to be able to go there without fear of being raided by the government.
So when we talk about groupthink, all I can think about is these people who praise this anti-immigrant sentiment and co-sign behavior and legislation and executive orders that directly harm children, that directly harm weak and vulnerable people. So that's what I think about groupthink. I think that it's dangerous. It's disgusting.
It is dangerous. It's for sure dangerous. You're being very specific, talking just about anti-immigration. And again, I didn't really want to do too much of delving into it because I know my purpose of having it in the case. So I like that you have...
Wait, it's not anti-fascism? That's not your purpose?
No. Crazy. It actually wasn't. It wasn't until you started talking about it.
It felt a little bit like a setup to me.
Yeah, no, it wasn't. When you started talking, I was like, okay, yeah. So the consensus is that groupthink is dangerous and...
Dangerous. I want to find the right word.
Yeah.
Because it strips you of, like you said, critical thinking, of your originality. It turns you into one of many. And I think there's a specific word for that. Automaton.
Yeah, that works. All right. Are you ready for me to get into this case? On the 5th of July.
All right, Alexander Hamilton.
Hamilton? On the 5th of July, 1967, in Cardiff, Wales, Lynette White was born. She would remain in Cardiff for the remainder of her life, barring a brief stint in Bristol. She did not finish school.
Bristol's not in Wales.
No, it's in England.
Okay.
And starting at the age of 14, she was sexually abused for money. I'm going to go out on a limb here because I couldn't really find information on
sex work, or was it?
Well, she's
traffic?
a child.
Okay, but I don't like what is the context?
Yes, sex work, but
still, obviously, it's all illegal. Illegal, bad, not good. We would never want a child to feel like that's something they had to do. It is sexual abuse. I was just curious if she was being trafficked. I guess that's what I should have asked.
I get into it a little bit. Give me moments.
Okay.
So I'm going to guess that she didn't have an easy childhood.
Right.
Filled with love and a sense of security. Because,
that sure would be wild if she did.
Well, this is how she got into the biz. A group of men drugged her and took her to Bristol and forced her into, quote, work as a sexually abused child.
Oh, so she was obviously trafficked.
Mm-hmm.
Why couldn't you just answer yes to that?
Because it was in the script. Why can't you just let me get through my script?
Sorry.
You're always asking me questions that are answered in the next sentence.
Well, you write so compellingly. I have to know.
While she did find her way back to Cardiff, she found herself trapped in this vortex of exchanging her sexual abuse for money. So for 4 years, she's being paid by creepy ass men in order to allow them to sexually abuse her. I'm sorry, did I say men? I meant pedophiles.
Is Cardiff large?
I think so. Why are we doing this?
Well,
Why?
I'm just curious. Is there like, I don't know if Cardiff was small, if it was large, if it was, like a finite supply of creepy pedophiles?
Look, my only reference point for Wales, in complete disclosure, is...
Batavia.
No. It's Tace,
oh, that's
the
right.
Vivian, and then one of the trivia hosts in Austin grew up in Wales, and I met her a couple weeks ago. That's really all I know. There's a dragon, I think.
Yeah, the Welsh dragon.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I did not delve a lot into Wales. I just know that that's where this took place.
Okay.
So
did they willingly become part of the UK? I don't think so.
I'm trying to think of the analogy that was told to me a few weeks ago. It's like how when technically Canadians are American, but when you say American, most people are thinking of the States,
mm-hmm.
but Canadians are usually very clear to point out that they're Canadian and not like
right
from the USA.
Okay.
So Wales apparently has that same type of vibe with England.
But they are part of the UK.
But they're part of the UK, yeah.
Like they're actually a part of the UK.
Right, but I think a lot of people think that the UK is England, and they don't really think about the other countries that are united in that kingdom. You really want to turn this into a UK podcast,
Bing,
and we
bang,
just
bong.
can't. We
Let's
can't
just
do it.
You just keep pushing. Don't ignore my questions.
I feel like that might defeat the whole purpose.
Yeah, not when they're so non-germane.
Well, at 18, Lynette was no longer a child, but she did continue to take money from men in exchange for sex. And she was successful in her industry. She did most of her work at the docks area of Butte Town. And early in 1988, Lynette was heralded as one of the hardest workers, putting in the most hours and being quite available.
That description is so disgusting. It produces imagery of like the WAP music video in my brain, somehow as a hybrid with the work from home music video by Fifth Harmony. Like someone in overalls throwing around sledgehammers, but also throwing it back. And like they're just really getting after it.
Yeah, sure.
Like some crazy bukkake. That's like the way you described it is her walking onto a fucking dock into this wild myriad of men just ready to bang it out.
No. So an acquaintance said that Lynette was, quote, the first girl out at lunchtime and the last one out at night, end quote.
That did not take away from the imagery and the perception of what I had seen.
Because I would never try to take that away from you.
And it's not funny. This is obviously going to be a very sad situation. I can already tell that by the conversation we're having, but that is a interesting depiction. And my brain's response to it is also quite interesting.
I think that's fair. Due to her prevalence, she was interviewed by Tom Rogers, a journalist for BBC Wales, for...
Okay, hold on. Lynette is such a prolific sex worker that they said, oh, we've got to talk to this woman.
Well, so he was doing an article about children who had been sexually abused, although at the time it was an article that they were calling about child prostitution.
Okay. But she wasn't a child at this point anymore, but she had experienced child sexual abuse.
Yeah. According to Lynette, she would make around 100 pounds per night, which if you adjust that for inflation and then convert it to US dollars, it's about 284 pounds or 350 US dollars. So $127,750 US dollars annually if she worked every day.
That's not as much as I thought you were going to say. I mean, she was doing just fine. Doing great, right? That would put her like in the top 1 percentile of Americans at this point.
Financially, yes.
Yes, financially. Sorry.
In theory. She was working every day because she had a boyfriend and he had a cocaine habit that kept Lynette busy.
On the Disney Channel.
I would have sworn it was a
Disney classic movie.
Biz tea, but I guess it was Disney. I don't know.
Cocaine is expensive.
Yeah, so that would explain why Stephen Pineapple Miller was both Lynette's boyfriend and her trafficker, probably more commonly known as her pimp.
Right.
And he got about 60 to 90 pounds off of Lynette every day, and she was his only source of income.
Oh, poor Lynette. I hope the story ends with her killing him.
I'm just going to say this up front. Stephen Pineapple Miller, I use those kind of interchangeably. So if I say Stephen, if I say Pineapple, if I say Miller, that's all the same person.
Okay.
But he went by Pineapple, or he was known as Pineapple. I couldn't not call him Pineapple.
Are we going to get the origin of pineapple?
I don't know it.
Okay.
I'm definitely open to anybody who does know it sharing it with me, but I've got no clue.
Listen up, Cardiff, Wales. If you know why Stephen Miller was referred to as pineapple, write in. Leave us an Instagram comment.
Leave us 10 comments on Instagram.
Yeah, put it in your 5-star review of the podcast.
The couple had a flat in Dorset Street, Cardiff, and every day Pineapple would drive Lynette to Riverside, Cardiff for work. And when she was done for the day, she would meet back up with him at North Star Club so that he could steal his share of the money from her. Because of the work Lynette did, she was not always in the safest or most controlled environments, and therefore she had seen some things, which is how she became a witness in not one, but 2 separate trials. Robert Gent and Eric Morosco were on trial for allegedly attempting to pay a child to sexually abuse them. The victim was 13 at the time of this. And that's all I was really able to find out about that trial, other than that Lynette was supposed to be called as a witness in it. I do have more information on the other trial. So on February 12th, 1988, Francine Cordell went on trial, quote, for attempted murder and wounding with intent, unquote.
All right.
Which, not surprisingly, would carry a pretty substantial sentence. Lynette had been issued a witness summons because she was serving as a witness for the prosecution, and it was to prevent her from not showing up to give her testimony about her own personal situation with Francine a few months before. Francine had allegedly stabbed Tina Garton using a knife, although she denied this. And Lynette was also stabbed by Francine in the shoulder a few months before.
What is Francine's problem?
I think she just forgets that she's got a knife in her hand and she goes to like comfort people or something.
Good job today. Here's a little pat on the back. Is she a madam?
No, I don't think so.
Then I don't know why she's stabbing people. Are they her competition?
I don't know. Shits and gigs, maybe.
Well, it doesn't even... Shits and shanks. I don't fucking understand what she's doing.
I don't know. But the prosecution wanted Lynette to establish this pattern of behavior to bolster their case against Francine. But Lynette did not show for the trial, and a warrant for her arrest was issued at that time.
Oh, Lynette. This is the last off-topic thing I'm going to say because
Great.
I'm having a hard time focusing.
Bring it on.
Lawyers in the UK.
Solicitors.
And then judges are magistrates?
Judges.
So what's a magistrate? Because I think that's a word they use in the UK for...
I said this a few minutes ago, and I'm going to stand by it. I will not let you turn this into a UK podcast.
I have to know.
Mm-hmm.
A magistrate in the UK is a trained volunteer who hears cases in criminal and family courts, making decisions on various legal matters. They are also known as justices of the peace and play a crucial role in the justice system by handling around 97% of criminal cases. I'm sorry, that's not a fucking judge?
It's a volunteer.
A volunteer judge?
Yeah.
Weird that they handle 97%, right?
Yeah. I had tuned out by the time you said 97%. So they had pushed the trial back to February 15th, and they went to her home looking for her because they needed her to be present by that date. But when they arrived at the flat she shared with Pineapple Miller, she was not...
Way too casual. Pineapple Miller. Sounds like a new fucking beer beverage.
Miller? If you
Miller.
need to advertise, we're here for you. So they went to her flat that she shared with Pineapple. She was not only not there, but she had not been seen for a few days. Her friend and coworker, Leanne Vilday, had grown concerned because she also had not seen Lynette in a few days. Actually, on February 10th, Pineapple Miller had grown angry because no one seemed to know where Lynette was. So he showed up at Leanne's residence looking for her. All of these details, this period of time, I think maybe February 8th to February 13th or 14th, not super clear. But I think that she maybe on the 10th just didn't come to the nightclub.
Okay.
Which likely caused his, I assume, cocaine-fueled anger to make him look for her at her close friends.
Mm-hmm.
That's Leanne and Lynette, not to be confusing. I didn't pick the names. And what was one of your victims in the last episode? Lorette? Okay, yeah. That with your perp's last name being White, and I had just researched all of this, really threw me off a few times when I was listening. Okay. So Leanne had another flat that she leased, but since no one lived there, or maybe because it couldn't be set up, it had no heater lights.
Okay.
It was a flat that was used solely for sex work, and it only had one set of keys, which Lynette had had for some time. After not being able to find Lynette for 5 days, Leanne called a taxi driver, Eddie Diamond, on February 14th.
These names are made up.
They're not. And it's Diamond without an A. Dimond? I'm going with Diamond. And she had him take her to the flat at number 7 James Street in Buttetown. Eddie was someone who knew both Leanne and Lynette. And again, Leanne did not have the keys because Lynette had had them for a period of time. So Leanne called up to another occupant of the building for the key to gain access to the building. So this neighbor tossed the key to her out of their window, but still, without her flat key, she couldn't access.
So just to be clear, this is Lynette's flat for sex work.
Leanne's flat for sex work. Lynette has had the keys for a while.
Okay. That's okay. See, I got confused and I was like, okay, well, is it Leanne or Lynette who owns the secondary flat?
How could you be confused?
Everything's been so clear and separate.
Clear as mud.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Leanne's neighbor tossed the key to her out of their window, but still, without her flat key, she couldn't access her leased space.
Okay.
They tried knocking on the door, thinking maybe Lynette had had enough of Pineapple Miller's shit, but when no one answered, she had Eddie drive her to the Buttetown police station to file a missing persons report. Because Lynette had been in possession of the keys to this uninhabited flat for quite some time prior to mid-February, 2 members of the police force accompanied Leanne and Eddie back to the flat on James Street and forced entry into the apartment just after 9 p.m. When they finally gained access to the flat, it was a gruesome scene they walked into. Next to the bed was Lynette's body, which had been mutilated. In addition to defensive wounds on her hands, she had wounds to her head, neck, wrists, inner thighs, and more than 50 stab wounds to her chest. Her throat was injured to the point that her carotid artery, jugular veins, and larynx were all severed and her vertebrae were exposed.
Oh my God.
This is the most likely cause of her death because of how rapidly she would have bled out from the neck injuries.
Did her murderer attempt to slice her head off?
Did he fail? I mean, it feels like he basically
Well, it sounds
did.
like he went through everything but the spine.
I don't know. So even with all of the other wounds she suffered, including the 7 times her heart had been stabbed, the neck injury was likely the cause of death. Bernard Knight, the pathologist, determined that it was a brutal mutilation that carried sexual tones. He identified 69 different wounds on her body, and based on his autopsy, Knight noticed that the severe neck injury, which would have caused rapid loss of consciousness and death, was inflicted relatively early in the attack, and most of the other wounds were caused after Lynette had already died. The murder weapon was not left at the scene and has never been recovered, although Knight believes that it has a 5-inch blade.
Okay.
Obviously, the type of person who would commit such a brutal and heinous murder was dangerous and posed a threat to others.
I mean, was it a crime of passion? This sounds like overkill.
It's definitely overkill. I guess there has to be some level of passion involved in a crime so brutal that continues on the body posthumously.
Right. Also, the stab wounds on the inner thighs.
The type of person who would commit such a brutal and heinous murder was dangerous and posed a threat to others, so the police wanted to find this person and get them off of the streets as soon as possible.
I imagine so. I think that would be objective number 1.
Yeah. You mentioned the stab wounds to the inner thighs.
Mm-hmm.
I think that that's probably in part where the sexual overtones
Has she been sexually assaulted in this?
come from. It would probably be very difficult to determine that
That's fair.
in her line of work and the hours that she puts in every day.
Yeah. I have to go back to the inner thighs because I think of that as being kind of this like very sexual erogenous zone. Like they're so tender, it's so close to your genitals, it's very sensitive. Like you had just said, I'm sure that's part of the sexual overtones, but it makes me curious if there was some kind of pattern or discerning characteristic that would make that seem more sexual than it already is. I mean, you've told me millions of times that stabbing is a psychosexual act or that it mimics penetration. And so I guess I find that really interesting to have not only stabbed the chest, what did you say, 50 plus times?
Mm-hmm.
The heart at least 6 times.
7, yeah.
7 times. The inner thighs, nearly beheading this poor woman. It's incredibly aggravated.
Yeah, there's something, and I'm not sure that this is based on anything other than you talking about the stabbing of the inner thighs is making me think that there's like a pathological hatred of a mother figure.
Okay.
But I don't know why that is like sticking out in my brain right now, because I don't even know that that has come from anywhere other than like that's from whence most people are born.
Right.
And so
close your legs to avoid pregnancy. It could be a purity thing. It could be this is the gateway to your vagina.
mm-hmm.
I want to scar and demarcate it and show that you were unpure, unclean.
Mm-hmm. So you come into this scene and then you get this pathologist report. What do you think took place?
Well, I want to be honest, and part of that is if I knew she was a sex worker,
Yeah, you know everything
Right.
that I've said to this point, you know all of that.
So I think I would assume maybe it was one of her regular Johns. Maybe it was someone who was envious or jealous of her relationship, or because she wouldn't engage in something more meaningful than being a sex worker to him, or maybe someone who kind of revered her and maybe she made some kind of misstep or miscalculation that outed her as not being as pure as he would have hoped in his imagination, and maybe flew into a fit of rage.
So most likely scenario for you is that she's got one client, she's in the apartment with this one male client, and that he kills her.
After some triggering event. Yes, that is what seems most likely to me. But of course, I'm not educated in criminality.
Okay. I think that's basically what I would also believe if I came upon this scene.
Okay.
So the first 24 hours after a crime scene is discovered is the most critical for discovering physical evidence. But between the delay in locating Lynette's body and the primary use of the flat being for sex work, it was not a very fruitful investigation.
The amount of DNA that would be in that flat.
I could only imagine, but I am not going to. It's not as if there was a ledger that Lynette kept with clients' information in it. There was no appointment book. So they struggled to identify the last person she had worked with. The case was frosting over. Evidence from the scene was taken, but DNA was in its infancy, with it only having been used to solve a murder for the first time 2 years prior. For more information on that case, listen to our episode, The Murders of Linda Mann and Dawn Ashworth, released September 5th, 2024. So there was an awareness, but there was by no means a database or a widespread understanding of the best practices of collecting DNA. I'm not saying that in this case it wasn't collected or preserved. I'm just speaking generally. I think the natural assumption that anyone would make, and definitely the one the investigators initially believed, was that Lynette's line of work probably indicated that a lone offender would be responsible for her murder. And this was furthered by a 16-year-old girl who claimed she saw a man who had blood on his hand near number 7 James Street at 3:05 p.m., the day Lynette's body was discovered.
It's wild to me that someone would kill in the daylight hours. Also, that poses an interesting question to me of when was she murdered? Because she was missing for several days. Why was she just killed that day that she was discovered?
So Knight, the pathologist, puts Lynette's time of death earlier in the day, closer to 2 a.m., based on the time of Lynette's watch being stopped at 1:45 a.m. and an ear witness reporting sounds of a woman screaming around 2.
Okay.
On March 4th, 1988...
I'm sorry. A woman screaming
at 2 a.m.
Would that not trigger some alarm bells for you?
This is a building in which a flat is not wired for lights or heat. And it seems like the most likely reason that it isn't is because it can't be.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that this is the neighborhood.
It is an apartment used for sex work, so I guess...
At least one of the units in it is used for sex work, and
what other kind of shady dealings might be occurring? Not to cast aspersions, but...
And the type of people who maybe live there maybe don't want the police coming to their neighborhood, to their home, to...
Yeah, I have to imagine not. That makes a lot of sense. Okay.
On March 4th, 1988, the first major development occurred when traces of a second donor's blood were found on Lynette's socks and pants.
Second donor?
Well, Lynette is the first donor.
Of what?
Blood.
Okay.
At the scene.
So is this another victim?
Well, considering Lynette was killed with repeated use of a knife, it would not be unlikely for her murderer to have cut themselves during the attack.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so the blood was typed and it was determined...
I thought you were using that as like a synonym for victim. And I was like, weird.
No, to be fair, that was phrased weird. Lynette was donor 1 because they knew her blood was at the scene. And then they found a second blood also. And it was typed and determined to be AB, and it had a Y chromosome, which is only found in persons who are assigned male at birth. So they were likely looking for a man with a rare blood type.
Was it AB positive?
I don't know the RH factor.
Because I think that's the most rare.
I still don't know. I know it was AB and I know it was a Y chromosome. This lead helped them narrow down their list of suspects since it was really the only starting point they had. Better than nothing. I talked about the Francine Cordell trial that Lynette was supposed to be a witness for the prosecution in, that she did not show up for, and I touched on the other trial that she was also expected to give witness testimony in. These cases seemed like a possible motive for her murder, attempting to silence a witness. Another motive the investigation postulated was that Lynette maybe had been avoiding Pineapple Miller, being his only source of income, and that he used the money she earned to pay for his cocaine addiction. They theorized that she maybe hadn't made enough money to satisfy him and did not want to be subjected to a potential violent rage as a result of that.
I don't think a pimp is going to kill his cash cow.
You make a really interesting point. So all of that to say this should not come as a surprise, but Stephen Pineapple Miller was a suspect from the very very beginning of the investigation.
Sure, and he should be. But by the same token, he's not going to get any sweet booger sugar if she's gone.
Right. Sweet?
Yeah, cocaine.
Is it sweet?
I don't know.
Sugar is sweet.
I mean, whatever it is, it sure is addictive.
Yeah, he probably had a snatched waist and a clean house, right?
I'm not familiar with the side effects of such illicit substances.
I'm not familiar with a snatched waist or a clean house.
You know what? I have nothing to say.
Early on, they had interviewed him as well as searched the flat he and Lynette shared, and they searched his car. They searched his car as well. The investigators also tried to retrace the steps Lynette followed during the days leading up to her murder, but that information has never fully unraveled. On February 7th, she stayed the night with Leanne, who said the last time she saw her was the following afternoon. Apparently, she was not staying at her flat with Pineapple in those days. Another tick in the her pimp boyfriend is a suspect column. And in attempting to learn about more of her movements during her final days, the investigation led to talking to friends, acquaintances, and possible clients. In addition to the identification of more than 300 clients of local sex workers, people who were known to rob sex workers, and 3,500 questionnaires that were handed out to local residents, all of that led to more than 3,000 statements. And 2 bands of witnesses emerged as having key information. The groups were comprised of 6 people in total, 2 in one group and 4, including Leanne, in the other. This group that Leanne was a part of was considered to be the most significant source of information. Therefore, the investigation referred to them as the Core 4.
Okay. Were they all sex workers?
No. I won't spend a ton of time talking about the Core 4 right now, but give it some time. But it was comprised of Leanne, her close friend and coworker Angela, who is a cisgender woman with whom Leanne had been staying in a place that was only 75 meters from the scene of Lynette's murder.
Were any of these women transgender?
No.
Okay.
Mark, who DJ'd at the North Star Club, where Leanne and Lynette frequented because of the hours they kept, because it was open late.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where Lynette met up with Pineapple Miller after work. And then Mark's friend Paul, who lived in another flat at number 7 James Street. Just a note, Angela and Paul had what was described as, quote, very low IQs. And several of the statements that Paul gave were inconsistent and diminished his credibility, or should have.
Okay, Angela and Paul. So 2 of the Core 4 were, quote, low IQ.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And because Paul seemed to have an inability to keep his story straight, it sounds like he was almost dismissed as being too unreliable.
Definitely should have been if he wasn't.
Okay.
Yeah. 2 women reported conflicting accounts about a man named Yusuf Abdullahi. One claimed to have heard him mention stabbing someone, and the other woman claimed to have heard him admit to killing Lynette.
It's so hard for me to ever fathom when in these cases we hear that someone goes around admitting or talking about having completed or contributed to these really heinous crimes.
Mm-hmm.
Like, would you like to be caught? Do you want someone to charge you with something? Are you trying to develop street cred? What?
Maybe it's an intimidation piece.
Yeah, it just feels like what is to be gained by saying that you, and of course I'm not a part of the culture in terms of understanding that type of thinking, but it just seems like it would be counterintuitive to continuing to do whatever shady dealings you might otherwise be in with.
Yeah. I mean,
it's the same energy as Mackenzie Shirilla having a bitch list and then writing down the bad things she'd done.
Can we address something?
Yes.
Can we address how you and I were like, don't write it down instead of don't do it?
Don't do bad things.
It was what we both noted immediately when we listened back to the episode. We both keyed in on the fact that we did not say don't do bad things. We said don't get caught doing bad things, which is obviously not what we were condoning or anything. So just to put that out there.
I think it's okay to have a list of people who you do not like. I think that's fair, fine. You should go through and have your feelings. And if you ever act on them in a way that is non-harmful, okay. Still don't write it down. I mean, I'm not trying to double down on my initial comment. I'm just saying use a modicum of the intelligence that you've been blessed with to make better decisions.
And 3 months after Lynette's body was found.
God, I hope a bitch list pops up in your case somewhere today.
We'll see. 3 months after Lynette's body was found, Leanne drunkenly and also maybe hopped up on speed told someone that Pineapple and Dullah, a nickname for Yusuf Abdullahi. So Leanne, drunk, also probably on speed, said that Pineapple and Dullah had killed Lynette and that she had witnessed the whole thing.
Leanne said this?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, then why would it have been a surprise when she went to her own flat?
Well, this was a scenario that the investigation could get behind. They found Leanne sus from the get-go because they believed that on the day Lynette's body was found, Leanne was behaving in a way that indicated that she knew what they would find once they gained access to the flat at number 7 James Street.
Okay, but I would add to that if you work in sex work, you understand that you are in a high-risk lifestyle. You understand that there are dangers associated with that profession. That wouldn't be new to Leanne. She'd probably been victim to all kinds of violence.
And when you think about the fact that apparently nobody had seen Lynette for 5 days after she was touted as the most visible, most available,
most
hardest
prevalent,
working,
most prolific, didn't miss a day of work.
And now she hasn't been seen for several days, which is confusing to me still because maybe Leanne didn't go to work for a few days and Lynette was still working, but it's still wild to me that no key players saw her between the afternoon of February 8th, but she wasn't killed, according to the pathologist, until the early hours of February 14th.
Something about that just does not add up to me.
It's right, same, and it never will. So Leanne allegedly saw this murder committed by Dullah and
but she
Pineapple.
Didn't. She didn't.
And so this was reported to the police 2 weeks after Leanne made this claim. And the police followed up with Leanne about what she had said. And this is where it gets really interesting because what Leanne told them was, yes, I said that, but I was drunk and high and it wasn't actually true. I was just saying things because I hated that Pineapple always took Lynette's money and squandered it.
Mm-hmm.
So she said she wanted to get back at him and was grieving the loss of her friend and the lack of movement in finding the violent maniac who had killed her.
I think that's fair.
Mm-hmm. So again, it was believed that likely this was the work of a lone perpetrator, someone who Lynette had believed was going to accompany her to the flat at number 7 James Street for a service, pay her, and then they'd go their separate ways. That's not only the most logical scenario, but the forensic evidence at the scene also indicated that this was a person who had acted alone. Mm-hmm. Which means naturally, the police found Leanne to be credible when they followed up on her claim that Stephen Pineapple and Yusuf Dullah had killed Lynette.
Okay, but she did say that they didn't do that. She just made it up.
Yeah, they didn't believe that part.
They didn't believe she made it up after she said she made it up?
Right.
She's only credible when they like what she says.
Weird. But despite believing her...
Do you think that's because she's a woman or because she's a sex worker?
Or do you believe that that's because she's implicating somebody that's already been on their suspect list?
Those damn suspects.
Their suspect list since the beginning of this investigation. What is happening?
You know, Pineapple has probably been on their suspects list longer than just this.
Oh, God.
If he's into all of this cocaine dabbling.
You're not wrong.
And pimping, they probably had him. You know what I mean? I wonder what the Cardiff authorities knew about all of these people before this crime.
That's a good question.
Were they on their radar? Did they have previous run-ins with law enforcement? Had they received any kind of consequences for illicit activities or behaviors? Had they ever chased Lynette out of the docks for being such a prolific... I hate that the P word. Okay, I'm glad it's not acceptable anymore, but saying someone was a prolific P word would be so alliterative and it would just like really tickle my brain. But being this
successful sex worker.
Yes, this successful sex worker, had she already received some kind of punishment. Listening to you say that he was their suspect on the suspect list really makes me wonder, what was their familiarity with this group of people?
This is a weird take because nothing ever said this explicitly, but it seems like there was a level of respect for Lynette. Like if the BBC Wales is interviewing her and they collected over 3,000 statements in an attempt to solve this murder.
There's an interesting dynamic in this community from everything you've just shared and everything you've told me over the course of the last hour that I hadn't thought about that. But if that many people in a community are coming forth and having something to share about Lynette.
They went to homes in the area and handed out 3,500 questionnaires. The police did, the investigators did.
There's something really odd about this case.
Mm-hmm. I also wonder if it's because of the brutality of the murder.
You don't want a murder like that running around Cardiff.
Right.
Okay, I'm ready for more.
Where was I? Oh, right. The police found Leanne credible when she said that Pineapple and Dula, while she was drunk and high, had killed Lynette. They found her credible entirely, but they still moved forward suspecting that Dula and Pineapple had worked together and murdered Lynette, Pineapple's only source of income, as you mentioned before. Here is a direct quote from the Mouncher investigation report on which I relied heavily to write this case. The desperation of the police officers attempting to solve White's murder was such that innovative and questionable measures were employed.
I love when they're innovative and questionable.
Mm-hmm.
We are on the cutting edge of illegal.
We are definitely not in ethical practices, I think, if we're going to read between the lines.
Mm-hmm.
So this alludes to the fact that Leanne was put under hypnosis to determine what she knew of Lynette's murder and if she had witnessed it or participated in it in any way. The hypnotist determined that Leanne had no knowledge of the murder and would be unable to help the investigation.
I'm sure the hypnotist knew a lot more than a trained mental health professional.
So after the hypnotist determined that Leanne would not be able to help the investigation and didn't know anything about the murder, silly hypnotist. That's irrelevant.
Did they listen to the hypnotist?
No.
Okay.
Psh, silly little hypnotist. What do you know? Mark of the Core 4 lived directly above the flat in which Lynette was murdered. During the likely time of her murder, he was asleep, so of course they assumed that was a lie.
I think that's a fair assumption.
And Paul, he was probably up till 2 a.m. writing a case.
Yeah. Been there, done that.
And Paul, who had a pretty long rap sheet, used to live at number 7 James Street. So even though none of his crimes were violent or sexual in nature, he of course had to have played a part in this crime that was extremely violent and determined to be sexual in nature by the pathologist.
You know, it begs the question of not only are we trying to find an answer in a reckless way, but it gives the feeling of we're trying to protect somebody.
Maybe.
I mean, why else would you be so desperate to pin it on a low-level criminal? I'm sure I'm going to find out soon enough.
So we talked a little bit about the Core 4 group that had emerged as key witnesses, and then the other group, the non-Core 4 group that consisted of 2 people. Those 2 were Pamela and Violet. About a month after the murder, Pamela really seemed to want to point the finger at Angela, who was her neighbor. She said she was acting weird around the morning of the death, or the day before the death, or originally the day before the death, but then she changed it to the day of the death, 8 months after her original statement. She'd thrown things away sketchily and, stuff like that. She wanted them to look into Angela. Violet, on the other hand, made a statement 9 months after the murder, and she said that 9 months earlier, she had been driving along James Street around 1:30 in the morning, and near number 7, she saw a group of men of color, and they were arguing, and it was heated.
Well, we know what that means.
Case closed.
Someone is going to be unfairly and untruthfully blamed for a heinous crime they didn't commit.
Hey, 2 of them she had seen before and would be able to select if she saw them again, but she absolutely did not know their names. None of their names. 6 days later, she knew that one of the men was Rashid Omar. Another of the men was probably, definitely, maybe, certainly John Actie. And the kicker was that Violet could not rule out Stephen Pineapple Miller as one of the 4 men either.
Was Stephen Caucasian?
I honestly think so, but I'm not 100% sure. I know that John Actie was.
Those aren't people of color then.
Whoa. See, here's the issue. Throughout the end of November and into the first days of December, the investigation really gained steam. It was chugging right along with evidence changing, and the Core 4's statements were a part of this change. The statements really varied. Sometimes they knew nothing, they hadn't seen anything, and other times they had witnessed 5 men murder Lynette. Anything that didn't...
5 men murder Lynette?
5 men murder Lynette.
Okay.
Anything that didn't seem to align with prior statements or other statements just kind of magically disappeared or were modified. And then even more magically, their statements began to match the, quote, evidence that the police had unearthed. Abracadabra, whether or not that evidence was scientific. And never fear, that questionable evidence that matched the Core 4's statements in a which came first, the chicken or the edge? What is happening? I cannot read. The chicken or the edge of glory. In a which came first, the chicken or the egg situation, was used to point the finger at 5 men for the murder of Lynette White. Stephen Pineapple Miller, Yusuf Dullah Abdullahi, Anthony Paris, Ronald Actie, and John Actie. Fun fact, some of this magical evidence came about after the investigators learned that Angela's blood type was AB. So of course it must have been her DNA that was found on Lynette's sock. Remember?
Mm-hmm.
It was also AB.
Okay. I wasn't aware that only one person in the whole of Cardiff was allowed to have AB blood, but okay.
Is there anything else that you remember about the blood?
That it had a Y chromosome.
Mm-hmm. Was there anything else that you remember about Angela?
That you said she was cisgender?
Mm-hmm.
And then when I asked you if there were any trans people in this.
Right. So this blood with the Y chromosome was Angela's.
So what, did she have a genetic abnormality?
I mean, are you reaching?
I know that's what happens. I know sometimes it's an intersex individual.
This person who didn't have any idea about what happened at the scene of this crime sometimes, but then also sometimes had been part of a 7-person party that was there participating in this murder. This is, what's it called? Occam's razor.
Right. The solution that is most likely to be true is true.
Right.
I'm not sure I understand the snare that you've set for me.
What you are saying, you're asking questions about her having a genetic abnormality and something that would cause her blood to have a Y chromosome present. That's a very rare thing. It is less rare that it was actually a man who had AB blood who killed Lynette.
Well, that seems more sensible and more likely and definitely more common.
You're also, even in you asking that question, that's a more sophisticated way of putting Angela at the scene than anything that the investigation did. They were just like, we're just gonna rip this part off that says anything about a Y chromosome. AB blood, she was there.
That's okay. Innovative was the right word for the techniques and thinking they've employed to solve this case.
I would like to hear your thoughts on this too. So now, these 5 men.
And Angela.
Well, just these 5 men. You'd assume they're buddies, pals.
Sure.
Acquaintances at the very least. But actually, none of them really associated with each other, including the Actie cousins, whose relationship was seemingly no more than they happened to share DNA. So they were probably all seen together at least once, naturally, because you probably spend at least some time together before brutally murdering a young woman, but gosh, no evidence ever turned up that would indicate that they had hung out.
Well, and just from the way you described the crime scene and the way that the pathologist viewed it, it doesn't seem like there was more than one person responsible for Lynette's murder, let alone 5 men. 5 men that would have had to have been incredibly violent.
I think that we can all agree that we know exactly what went on here. These 5 men, no more than strangers and barely linked to the core 4, with Leanne and Angela in tow, killed Lynette in Leanne's uninhabitable flat, forced the 2 women to slash Lynette's wrists so as to implicate them in the crime and ensure they would keep their mouths shut about it.
There's some real mental gymnastics going on with this police force.
Maybe some groupthink, I don't know.
It pushes this idea even further that there was more than just a desire to solve the case.
On December 7th, Stephen Pineapple Miller, Tony Miller, Yusuf Abdullahi, Ronnie Actie, Rashid Omar, and Martin Tucker were all arrested. Please, no questions about the random names that have not come up until this very point.
Like Martin Tucker.
No questions.
And then, is Tony Miller the same as Pineapple?
No, that's Stephen.
Oh my God. Okay. And what happened to the Actie brothers?
Well, they're cousins. Ronald Actie was arrested on December 7th. On December 9th, John Actie and Anthony Tony Paris were arrested.
All in relation to this crime?
Mm-hmm.
How did we go from 5 to what number now? 7? Plus the 2 women? 9?
It's a lot. Over the next 4 days, investigators interviewed Pineapple Miller, who had the intellectual capacity of a preteen, 13 times. The first 2 interviews, he was denied any legal representation, and over the 19 hours that they spent interviewing him, he denied knowing anything about Lynette's murder 307 times.
Do they have anything like Miranda rights in the UK?
This is not a UK podcast, Hayden. I will not let you.
Says the British citizen.
I don't know, okay?
Well, okay. I asked that because you used the verb denied.
Right.
And so I was just curious if that's something they were allowed to do. Can you
My guess is a lot of the rights that are afforded to us in this country, whether they were spelled out or not, are based on the same system from whence we came.
I guess now that we're headed back to a monarchy.
So he said at least 307 times. No, not at least. He said it 307 times, and then he confessed.
Well, 1 confession to 307 denials. Easy math. Obviously, he did it.
So the confession that Stephen Miller gave implicated Tony Paris heavily, and also implicated Dula and the 2 Actie cousins, John and Ronnie. It also consisted entirely of information that had been released to the public or that had been shared with him by investigators during their interviews. Nothing that the investigators heard from Stephen was revelationary. Despite Stephen's confession, all 4 of the men he implicated denied any participation and gave alibis. Okay, I didn't include this. It said in there that they were of varying, I guess, credibility, basically. Like some of them had decent alibis and then others, I don't know, were asleep for 10 hours. I don't know. This group of men became known as the Cardiff Five and were set to be tried for Lynette's murder.
Now, that sounds a little familiar. Cardiff 5.
Like Core 4, Central Park 5. What's the familiarity? Or like
know.
You've heard of the Cardiff Five?
Maybe that.
Okay.
I mean, I don't think they end up being... I don't think that's the... But maybe I've heard something about this case before.
Maybe. It's possible. Do you ever consume any true crime? Well, then it's possible.
It's possible, but I usually skip over any British bullshit. No, I'm just... Oh, it's not even British. Welsh bullshit. You know what? Honestly, though, if any of you countries are looking for highly educated new permanent residents, I can take back and retract every negative thing I've ever said about anything related to the UK.
Wow, so you're not really standing by your statements.
Not 10 toes down. No, ma'am. No, I'm not.
So the Core Four were all going to be witnesses for the prosecution.
Sure.
But Leanne wrote her friend a letter in January 1989 that indicated that she had been essentially given 2 options by the police once the Cardiff Five had been arrested. She could either go along with the police's case against the 5 men, or she could go to prison for the murder herself.
Oh my God. What the fuck is happening with the Cardiff police?
In this letter, she claimed multiple times that she had been telling the truth about what she knew, or really what she didn't know, for the first 10 months. She only lied so she could, quote, have got out of that fucking police station. I was scared to death, end quote. There's some storyline about a man who was in the same prison block as Anthony or Tony Paris, who told an investigator whom he had spoken with multiple times that Anthony had told him that he and the other 4 Cardiff 5 men had killed Lynette, and Leanne and Angela had also been there and been required to participate in the murder. And this guy became a witness for the prosecution, but was later charged with perjury.
Okay. Well, I'm glad someone is being rightfully charged.
The trial commenced on October 3rd, 1989.
I can't believe that we are going to trial in this case as it is so far. I cannot believe that this is about to make it to a judge. I can't believe it's about to be litigated.
The prosecution had decided that Lynette and Pineapple had argued on February 9th, so she left. And because she was his only source of income, he became furious and took 4 semi-strangers with him to teach her a lesson. They found her at the flat on James Street, and then the lesson went too far. Not to revisit some of the more grotesque elements of this case, but she was virtually decapitated and stabbed in the heart 7 times.
Mm-hmm.
And the injury to her throat happened very early in the attack. So if the prosecution was going to listen to their own theory, they might raise their eyebrows at it. Cute detail that I thought I'd add: only Stephen Miller had ever confessed to the murder after 19 hours of interrogation over 4 days, and he had the mental capacity of an 11-year-old. Despite there being some scientific evidence preserved from the scene, the prosecution didn't use any of that. They just stuck to the one confession and then all of the witnesses whose accounts evolved to fit the investigation's theory over time. This is especially delightful to add because the prosecution stated that Angela's blood was the second sample found at the scene. And again, forget the Y chromosome present in the AB blood. Angela's blood was AB, so it had to have been hers. I mentioned that the trial began on October 3rd, 1989, and on February 26th, 1990, the presiding judge was scheduled to deliver his summation, but instead he died and they had to start the whole process over.
Oh my God. Oh my God. I am so mad for these Cardiff 5. I am aggrieved for them. Do they have a right to an expedient trial in the UK?
You want me to have researched every facet of the Welsh justice system?
Oh, is it their own justice system?
I don't know. Why are you asking me questions?
I don't know. Bing, bang, bong. Ding, dang, dong, sing, sing, song.
Yeah, UK, hun.
Mm-hmm.
I am not. Okay, so here's a snippet of his summation.
The one who died?
Yes. Yeah, he had written it.
Okay.
And was going to read it, but instead of doing that, he died.
It was really selfish of him.
Snippet of the summation. There is a suggestion that the evidence against each of the 5 defendants has been made up.
A suggestion?
There is not a shred of evidence that it happened, which indicates that he was likely to acquit the Cardiff 5, lacking substantial evidence to convict them.
So what, the Cardiff Police Department murdered him?
Jesus.
They're in the business of setting shit up.
2.5 months later, this do-over trial began, and all but one of the characters from the first trial was called by the prosecution. The other one was requested by the defense as a witness because he had done such a poor job the first time, hence the prosecution abandoning him as a witness for their case. And after his testimony, which the judge did allow after the defense requested him, the judge told the jury that he was not credible and they could not consider any of his testimony during their deliberation.
Oh my God.
He also deemed Leanne and Angela discredited witnesses since all of their accounts were contradictory.
Does that mean the prosecution couldn't use that as evidence any longer?
No, he just, I think told the jury these witnesses are not 100% credible. The cellmate of Anthony, Tony, was again asked to testify, although the court was cautioned about his testimony because he apparently had all of the informations on all of the trials and bore witness in just so many. It was like a hobby he had developed while he was incarcerated. This was what he did.
Wow.
Everybody confesses to this guy. Everybody owns up to their crimes. This second trial concluded November 22nd, 1990. The Actie cousins were acquitted, but the other three were convicted, and so they updated their boy band name to the Cardiff Three in the headlines.
I'm sorry, the other three were convicted?
Convicted.
Shut the front door.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I know what you're thinking. There's a possibility that these three guys had nothing to do with the murder of Lynette White.
That sounds right to me.
And don't worry, you are not alone. Apparently, the public also thought this was a possibility.
Mm-hmm.
4 years after Lynette's murder, a documentary was released on the BBC questioning the investigation, the credibility of the prosecution's witnesses, and whether or not these men were wrongly convicted.
They sure weren't rightly convicted. I'll tell you that.
So with that in mind, December 1992 brought about an appeal, and I hope you appreciate me sharing the name of the justices as much as I appreciated the names of the justices. So first off, we have Lord Chief Justice Lord Taylor.
Okay.
Then Mr. Justice Popplewell, and finally Mr. Justice Laws.
Okay.
These justices, in a rare move, condemned the police work that ultimately led to the convictions of these men, particularly after the transcript of Stephen's confession was reviewed, in which, after repeatedly stating, "I was not there," in various forms, the clincher of their whole damn case was this line, quote, I am just certain that I wasn't there. That's all. I am certain I wasn't there, but it could happen. It could have happened. Aha! Proof positive.
And that was the confession?
Yeah. So the police conducting this interview really held on to that and continued to interrogate him relentlessly until he said what they wanted him to say. And then they'd back off. It took 13 hours to brainwash him to the point that he was open to the idea that he could have been responsible for Lynette's murder. This was after legislation mandated that interviews be recorded, which makes it probably not difficult to imagine what unrecorded interviews were like prior to this mandate.
Mm-hmm.
Simpler times for investigators, am I right?
Yeah, for fabricators.
Well, on December 10th, 1992, Stephen's conviction was overturned, shortly followed by the overturning of the convictions of Dula and Tony's appeals. This left the investigation of Lynette White's murder open still, but the police were maybe butthurt about this.
Mm-hmm.
So it was decided that they would not be continuing with this investigation because, duh, the Cardiff 3 or 5 were obviously responsible.
This is the laziest fucking police force. I have no interest in visiting Cardiff, I can tell you that.
It's weird because it's all you've been talking about for years.
I've always wanted to go to Wales.
In 1999, 2 retired senior detectives, William Hacking and John Thornley, were basically brought in to investigate the investigation, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
They reported back in May 2000, after surviving Y2K, with some critiques. I'm not going to get into their criticisms because it would be longer than a Lux Noir London dissertation on how Lucy LaDuca doesn't have anything exciting to contribute to drag.
Nothing new or original?
It was 477 pages long.
Well, I would love to say I'm surprised.
Suffice it to say, there was an issue or two with the investigation. They also made 107 recommendations that ultimately led to the relaunch of the criminal investigation into actually determining who murdered Lynette White.
Mm-hmm.
Since the original botched investigation, to put it nicely, the National Database for DNA was set up in 1995, so they had a few more tricks up their sleeves, with respect to that blood with the Y chromosome and the AB typing,
Mm-hmm.
but they didn't have a lot of that left to test.
Okay.
So they weren't sure if they were going to, because then they didn't have anything. But they did end up getting the DNA profile, and they discovered that it was not in the database.
Okay.
All was not lost, though. Remember how the police in Deliana Heng's murder had to painstakingly sort through fingerprint after fingerprint to find the identity of a potential suspect in her murder, especially since you brought that up last week?
Mm-hmm. How could I forget?
Right. They kind of did the same thing, but with the DNA profile, attempting to establish a familial match that would lead them in the direction of someone whose blood would have been left at the scene of a stabbing murder. By the time they found one, it was early 2003, and the familial match was to a 14-year-old male. His uncle was made a person of interest and spoke with the investigators in February. He told them that he had known Lynette, contracted her services in the past, and that he had actually had sex with her about a week before her murder in the very same flat in which she was later killed.
Mm-hmm.
He also, I guess, had only been following the headlines that talked about the Cardiff Three's convictions because he was under the impression that they had already solved this case and gotten their guys. The police believed they had got their guy, finally, and they released this man after collecting a sample of his DNA because they didn't have enough to hold him until they had a positive DNA match, and they were not going to screw this investigation up again. Obviously, it was not likely the same investigators on this case in 2003, but you probably feel a lot of pressure and scrutiny when you're on a case that was already so royally fucked. But they believed that this was their guy, so they kept their eyes on him, tailing him the following day as he bought a large quantity of paracetamol.
Okay.
What do you think they believed he was going to do with all that paracetamol?
Crush it up and sprinkle it on some flowers? No, obviously take his own life.
Right. So they busted down his door and found that he had indeed overdosed on paracetamol.
I didn't even think you could buy that many drugs in the UK.
Paracetamol?
Yeah, like I think that you can't even buy like large sums of over-the-counter medication.
In 2003?
I don't know.
Me either.
I'm not a British citizen.
You keep trying to turn this podcast into a British podcast, though.
It's not even running. We're talking about Welsh.
You keep trying to turn it into a UK podcast. So they got him transport to hospital, and on the way there, Jeffrey Gafour said, "Just for the record, I did kill Lynette White. I've been waiting for this for 15 years. Whatever happens to me, I deserve. I sincerely hope that I die." And he told a nurse while in hospital that the police wanted him alive so he could go to trial because he had killed someone a decade and a half prior.
Okay.
On March 4th, when he was discharged from the hospital, he was interviewed and declined legal counsel. He was forthcoming about some of the information about himself, including that he was an introvert who had not communicated with his family in nearly a decade, liked long walks on the beach. But when it came to the details surrounding Lynette's murder, he clammed up. He was charged with murder, and the two solicitors that ultimately did take on his case were acutely familiar with the case, one having represented Dula and the other having represented one of the Actie cousins in the first trials. 4 months after his release from hospital, July 4th, 2003, Jeffrey Gafour pleaded guilty to murdering Lynette White and implicated no one else, assuring the court that he and he alone was the sole perpetrator.
Well, now it feels like someone else helped him.
What?
Assuring them that he and he alone was the sole perpetrator?
I don't think that was coming from him.
Oh, okay.
No, don't you think after the... Okay, I mean, we haven't talked about the media's coverage of this, but don't you imagine the UK media was having a heyday with this?
I don't know. I think of them as being more classy than American media.
Yeah, I think you and Princess Di share that sentiment.
Anyways, field day.
So don't you think that everybody knew that more than one person had been found guilty of this initially? And so don't you think it was probably the court that was making sure with him that he was the only person who did this?
Yes.
It matches the forensic evidence.
Right.
Be one person. It's just so crazy. It's so crazy how we got here. Not how we got here, but how we got to the Cardiff 5 and the Cardiff 3 and the Cardiff 19 or whatever it ended up being. The number of people involved in this case when it was really just him. He was sentenced to life in prison, which I think is automatic when you plead guilty to murder or if you're found guilty of murder.
Okay.
He expressed that he felt bad that the other men were wrongfully accused of what he had done.
Not bad enough to confess.
And he recognizes the stigma that they likely still have surrounding them as a result of his wrongdoing and lack of accountability. The judge, who found it to be egregious that he would let these other men be falsely accused and convicted, at least initially, for something that he knew that they had nothing to do with, sentenced him to a minimum of 12 years and 8 months of his life sentence before he would be eligible for release. Eventually, it was revealed that he, at age 22, had sought Lynette's services late on February 13th, and they had gone to number 7 James Street into the flat Leanne rented. He paid Lynette £30, but then he changed his mind about wanting the service and requested a refund. He alleged that she refused to give him his money back. And so in an attempt to scare her into returning the money, he pulled out a knife. She did not get intimidated by the knife, maintained her refusal to refund him the money, and attempted to get the knife from him, during which or after which she was stabbed. And then he takes ownership for all of the mutilation that was then perpetrated on her body, documented by the pathologist.
Okay.
This is his retelling of this, and that's the only version that we have. So
It doesn't necessarily feel false.
I'm sure that there are elements of it that are true, just
Uh-huh.
like in any situation where you get both sides of the story. Both are going to have some true elements. We just don't have her side of the story because he killed her.
Yes. Brutally, viciously,
Yeah.
unrestrainedly.
It just felt like a lot over 30 pounds, right? And most of it done posthumously.
I'm sure that her body became a conduit of a lot of rage.
Eventually,
Sounds like real incel activity.
Eventually, a statement was made apologizing for the shoddy original investigation and trial of men who were clearly innocent.
And who apologized? Every single one of the police? Because anything short of an individual apology from each person is bullshit.
Was probably the department. Eventually, a statement was made apologizing for the shoddy original investigation and trial of men who were clearly innocent if you just looked at the literal facts of the case and the supposition by the pathologist and initial detectives that there was clearly only one person responsible for this crime.
What is an apology worth? What good is an apology when the victim was brutally murdered and then you took people who were either loosely connected to her or loosely connected to her acquaintances, with the exception of her substance abusing boyfriend and pimp, and creating this dynamic where every person who's a part of this weird constellation is treated as subhuman. I mean, likely because they're already from the drudges of society. They are at the far end. They probably have some kind of established criminal history or at least criminal reputation. And it feels like the Cardiff police went for the lowest hanging fruit because they wanted to clear their tally. They wanted to mark out the red in their notebook. How is it that we can most expeditiously handle this case and potentially get rid of other criminals that will continue to be on the scene in Cardiff? It feels intentional. There was a willful disregard for the facts, so I don't give a fuck about the apology that's issued.
It feels almost like at some point it shifted from, well, we don't have enough to actually solve this crime, so we're going to take this opportunity to find people, like you said, to get off the streets one way or another. Like, they're not going to be in our hair for at least a while if we get them convicted of a murder that they didn't commit.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's a reason that I asked you about groupthink at the beginning. I think that somebody in this investigation at some point really tunnel visioned on Stephen Miller and took anything that anybody said that could have led to him, which then ended up leading to other people who were not even his acquaintances. And it just kind of snowballed because everybody was along for that ride.
I can see elements of groupthink, But I think what seems even more prescient is a malingering, willful ignorance and a malingering sense of denial, laziness, convenience. I do believe that people probably at some point fell in line, and the motive behind their operation was to find evidence or testimony that would fit the narrative they'd created. But it's so much more sinister.
So you keep saying that, but I think this is really interesting because in all of my research, it never felt like it was intentional. It felt like they really truly believed that they had got the right guys. Did it match the evidence? No. And all of that feels sinister, I think, has come from the way that I have presented the case and all of the sarcasm and the snarky things that I have said.
Mm-hmm.
But when you actually read, in particular, the Mouncher investigation report, it really seems like they got tunnel vision and lazy, sure. But it doesn't really feel like they were doing it to intentionally be wrong. I think that they genuinely believed that Stephen Miller had something to do with it, and it just snowballed, which is why I keep going back to groupthink, because when I was reading that is what I kept taking away from it, is like, how did we all get on board with this when it's clearly so wrong? And I don't think that it was people sitting around in a room thinking, how do we get these guys? I think that they just started going along with crazy theories, and there were no bad ideas in brainstorming, and they took it and ran with it. So when somebody finally said, because do people who kill or who commit different crimes, do they initially deny it and then sometimes they do confess to it? Sure. And that's what they were hearing, even though he said, I guess maybe it's a possibility that I could have, but I really don't think that I was. And they were like, we got our guy. And it was very tunnel vision. And I don't want to take away from your perception of the case, but a lot of the things that you're saying to me, I'm like, I feel like that was stuff that I put on the case. So I do want to just acknowledge that in the sources that I looked at, it never felt that the police were doing this with any intentional malice. Doesn't make it better, but I just feel like I'm hearing you repeat back to me my take on the case, where the sources I looked at were a lot more neutral than I obviously have been.
There is no way for us to know their exact intent, right? And if we're talking about malice, if we're talking about malintent, we have to know what the intentions are. We have to have a more clear and defined idea of what that looks like. But what is clear is that their intention wasn't finding the truth. Their intention wasn't getting to the bottom of who killed Lynette White. That was not their ambition. That was not their goal.
I think that they thought that they had found the people responsible for her murder. I don't think that they...
From the evidence you shared with me, if I remove myself from the obvious point of view that you told your story through, and the perspective, the language you used, the connotation of the language you used, when I see that there was this unambiguous dismissal of evidence, of genetic evidence, when I see that they were fine with intentionally ignoring other pieces of evidence, it's really hard for me to sit here and say, I think that they thought they had the right person. That's hard to believe.
Right. But I also think that you have the ability to zoom out, whereas every step along the way, yeah, they may be dropping a piece, but they don't realize that they've lost the entirety of the investigative material until they're too far gone.
Right. I'm not on the train. I'm not accelerating. I'm not a part of the investigative team. I can't give them the credit you're giving them. And again, I know that you're not saying something to their benefit, but you presented another case where I had really similar feelings as I do right now. And I think where you and I both kind of stood kind of in the same positions of, I can't remember what case it was.
Well, I don't know what you're talking about.
You don't know which case or what I'm talking about?
Not based on the information you've given me, no.
You shared a case where I had really strong feelings and I thought that there was malice, and not that you were defensive, but you tried really hard to highlight the other perspective, and I just couldn't get behind it. And that's kind of where I am right now. I hear what you're saying.
Yeah.
I'm not saying it's untrue. I just can't agree to it.
I just want to make it clear that what you're saying is based on the information that I got being filtered through me.
Right.
And so I'm just acknowledging that.
Right.
I want to put that out there, because if you were to go and look at the Mouncher report, I don't know that you would walk away feeling the exact same way that this script that I have written.
Who was the Mouncher report written by? Mouncher. That wasn't the report by the investigators, was it?
It was by Richard Horwell, QC.
What was his profession?
I don't know. What is QC? You can find the Mouncher report on on the House of Commons website.
Well, and the reason I asked that is cops look out for cops. I assume that transcends American ideals of what a justice system looks like. I think that most people feel camaraderie and duty to their fellows in their field and their profession.
Yeah, no. So, there was none of that. When I get a little bit further down, you'll see that there was no "we're looking out for our own" going on
there's
here.
More?
This was, the Mouncher report is published on a .gov website. Well,
listen, we can move on, because I thought we were wrapping up the case. I thought we were giving final thoughts.
No. Okay.
You shouldn't have given it such a sense of finality.
Oh, you asked that question in the middle of that sentence. That sentence is the first in my paragraph.
Okay.
So, in a wild turn of events that
your final paragraph?
Nope. And in a wild turn of events that I can only hope and imagine would not happen in 2025, several of the people who were coerced and whose low IQs or limited mental capacities were used against them to create the testimony needed to prosecute the Cardiff Five were tried for perjury. 5 out of the 6 from those 2 initial key witness groups were tried for perjury.
Okay.
After they were coerced into those statements and confessions. The silver lining, 13 police officers, some who had already retired, and 2 civilians who played roles in the original investigation were charged on March 2nd, 2009. Each officer faced a minimum of 1 count of conspiracy to pervert the course of justice, amidst other charges. This case has created a shitstorm of legal action in the aftermath, but it wasn't really worth getting into all of it. I think what a lot of it boils down to is that everyone did something unethical throughout the course of the investigation, and they're upset that they're being held liable for that complicity in wrongfully convicting men of a crime.
That they're being held accountable.
Right. That was far more cut and dry than the elaborate monster it grew to be. So even with the pathologist stating that Lynette died very early during the attack, with most of the injuries inflicted on her body after she had died, they had the Cardiff 5 or 3 or however many torturing her to teach her a lesson. And it just went too far. Just nothing matched, and everyone who ignored the actual evidence, pathologist's report, and details of the crime was responsible for disrupting the lives and futures of 5 men who were strangers. In an article dated October 17th, 2024, it was announced that Jeffrey Gafour, who had been in an open prison since 2020, had earned day release status in January 2023, would be released from prison after serving 21 years in prison. In another article dated November 10th, 2024, after requests were made for this release to be reviewed by an attorney representing John Actie, it was announced that the release ruling would not be reviewed and that he would be granted release. John Actie says that this doesn't really surprise him, that nothing really surprises him.
If you want to kill somebody, like you just want to experience the thrill of it, move to the fucking UK. Move to one of these European countries where no one's getting a life sentence. There's no death penalty. You get a fucking slap on a wrist for taking someone's life and mutilating their body. What is fucking 21 years?
After 15 years of being out before that.
Yeah, I mean, what? Wow. I never feel more American. I never feel more patriotic than when you bring these international cases. And I'm like, what is this punishment?
Well, okay, if we talk about, we're just referencing every case that we've ever done at this point. If we talk about Mary Vincent and the gross injustice
100%.
of the monster who attacked her, I mean, he was incarcerated for what, 7 years? Right. In part, I wonder if this has to do with the fact that you are subject to the laws surrounding the trial, the sentencing, the everything that were in place at the time of the crime. He wasn't being sentenced in 2003 or 2004 based on a 2004 standard. He was being sentenced based on a 1988 standard. And so I wonder if there is something there that also could account for that.
I doubt it, but maybe.
So John Actie
Sorry, I just
says that this doesn't surprise him.
Me either, John Actie, if I'm being honest.
That nothing really surprises him, and that they were always going to let Jeffrey Gafoor walk free someday. I guess it's just important to note that Gafoor will be released under provisions that would send him back to prison if he is found to violate them for whatever that's worth. And that is the case of the murder of Lynette White and the wrongful conviction of the Cardiff 3.
I am irritated.
Yeah.
Because, okay, I'm going to start with most frustrating element to least frustrating element. And all of that is said with, I really enjoyed this case. I really did. It was interesting. It kept me involved. I wanted to know how things would play out. I felt compelled to share my thoughts. So wonderful work.
You also didn't have to root for the poison.
Great job. No, I didn't. There was literally an actual victim in this case that was sympathetic.
Several, I think.
Yes. Oh, yes, of course.
Also, he did plead guilty, so the sentence is usually lighter when you plead guilty versus going through the process of being found guilty.
Whatever.
Right.
I think the most frustrating part to me is, I know it was something you kind of glossed over, but the 13 police officers or investigators that were charged with what exactly again?
Perverting the course of justice.
I feel like if you've been charged with perverting the course of justice, fucking perverting, what excellent language. What a serious charge. That's more than ignorance. That's more than tunnel vision, at least to me. And there is a level of malfeasance that I just find acceptable, regardless of what you've explained to me. I am most upset with this police department, with these investigators. I don't care if they believed they were doing the right thing. They weren't. And impact matters more than intent.
Would it make you feel any better if you knew that after the civil proceedings against those 15 defendants, the 13 officers and the 2 civilians, that 15 claims were brought forth by them with various combinations of malicious prosecution?
That they were maliciously prosecuted, or that they had maliciously prosecuted?
That they had been maliciously prosecuted, falsely imprisoned.
Wait, these 15 investigative defendants said they'd been falsely imprisoned?
13 were officers, 2 were civilians, but yes.
Yeah, so were the Cardiff 3 and the Cardiff 5.
And the other 2 guys who were arrested and then ultimately released. And the 2 women who were apparently there told that they had to either testify or go to prison.
You're not special because you're a fucking cop. See, there's this kind of untouchable attitude. Ooh, don't get me started, because it's about to become a whole different kind of podcast.
UK, if you have your way.
But that's what bothers me most about this case. I hate that. I think they should all face criminal penalties, and I think they should spend at least as much time in jail as the Cardiff 5 and the Cardiff 3 did. I think that would be fine and equal, because they shouldn't be given the opportunity because they did not extend one to them. Secondly, I'm upset that Larry Gufford is...
Jeffrey Gafoor.
What did I say?
Larry,
Jeffrey.
You said Larry Gufford, and it's Jeffrey Gafoor, so it was very close.
I think it's upset that Jerry Gafoor
Jeffrey
Gafford is free after 21 years. He should get at least 1 year for every time he stabbed
Lynette.
Mm-hmm. I think that would be fair. Each stab is a year. Sure. Then you can be free to go. That's at least 50 times in the chest.
Yeah. I mean, in theory, he's going to be released soon or has already been released. I don't think he's already been released. I could not find anything that said that, but it's soon. It was 2 months ago that they said, we're not going to review that. He's going to be released.
I don't often say this.
Oh, good.
But I think the UK could learn a thing or two from the American justice system.
Somebody write this down. January 2025. January 26th, 2025. I
don't know how the people, did she have any family that cared for her or loved her or grieved her?
Yes, I found like one line about them sending, I want to say it was in one of those two articles, either the October 2024 or the November 2024, where there was just a line about, I don't know, condolences to the family and friends of Lynette White.
21 years can't feel like justice to them.
No, absolutely not. 21 years, though, is more time than she was allowed to live.
Yeah, so at least double that.
Well, or you take the average life expectancy of a sex worker in 1988 or just a woman in 1988 in the UK, and then you take her 20 years that she lived off of that. I think that if you kill somebody, you should have to serve out the average life expectancy remainder of the life that you robbed them of.
Sure, that's a fine idea. Thank you for bringing this frustrating case to my attention. I did enjoy your storytelling. I think you created a really great narrative structure because it kept me engaged the whole time. I wonder if there will ever come a time where it feels like Lynette received her due justice. And I'm sure the answer is no, and I also hope that there is a time when the Cardiff Five and the others involved feel like they also received a form of justice.
I think it's very telling when in November of 2024, which is nearly 36 years after the fact, John Actie saying, "I'm not surprised, nothing surprises me." They were always going to let him out, talking about how it has ruined his life and how we know that it very likely ruined the lives of everyone else. Plus, Stephen Pineapple, for all of his flaws, this was still somebody who he lived with, and he had to care about her on some level, whether it was a healthy or more likely toxic dynamic. So he's grieving the loss of her and then also grieving the loss of his own sense of normalcy, which does sound coked out, but still. But John Actie saying that 36 years almost after the fact, 35 years after he got caught up in whatever this is. I still don't even understand how these people got brought into the scenario, but I think that that's very telling as to the fact that they probably don't and won't feel like they ever got justice.
Yeah.
Even if they got money, you can't wash the stigma off.
No.
You can't. But I'm glad that you enjoyed it. Really, you're giving me credit for the way I crafted it, but I kind of just went mount your investigative report. And I really relied heavily on that. I used some other sources to set up background information about Lynette White. And then obviously the 2024 articles were not from that, but kind of everything else was. The mount your report was pretty shady in some areas. For an official document. I read that line to you about the innovative and questionable methods. So,
well, and right they were.
But I'm glad you enjoyed it. And, here's to hoping that people get justice ever. A complete list of sources and any links can be found in the show notes.
And that's all we've got for this episode. If you enjoyed listening and want to hear more, please subscribe, give us a 5-star rating, and leave a review.
Make sure that you are recommending us to a friend at any and every opportunity, because that is one of the best ways for us to help this podcast grow is by word of mouth.
Yeah. And make sure you're following us at End of Crime Pod on Instagram.
Our email address is endofcrimepod@gmail.com. So feel free to reach out with questions or episode suggestions.
And thank you for listening to this downloaded episode.
Until the next crime.